fascinating book.
It's a very interesting book. I only got it last week and I haven't finished it yet, but it's a very interesting and novel perspective on a problem that very few of us have thought about, I think.
Exactly.
Yeah, it is, you know, every page challenges our assumptions or even our prejudices. It's really good. I suspect this evening I'm not going to be asked to say too much because I think everyone's probably has everyone had a chance to read it? Ish.
Yes,
I'm about 150 pages into it.
Right.
Well, I only haven't read about the last 20 or 30. So
pages, you mean?
Yes. What do you mean, books?
Oh,
Should we get going?
Just an administrative thing. Esther, can I ask you to do some reading?
yeah, sure.
So I'll tell you roughly what bits, but there's so much good stuff in the book that I think I'm going to try and let it speak for itself as much as possible.
To the extent that you haven't covered in what you're attempting to do, I've also got certain sections that I'd like to ask you in particular and others questions about. So, but
right.
You'll have them covered anyway. But yes.
Yeah, see what you said.
I agree.
Oh. Yeah, I'm just putting my leg up.
Just a little pause because Esther needs to put her legs up. So she's doing that while she's sitting. So all is good. Hi, Cecil. Welcome.
Hi, Cecil.
So let's kick off because it is just gone 8. The book, as we all know, is Aftermath: Life and the Fallout of the Third Reich. And if you want a good endorsement from somebody who I know most of us really respect, a brilliant book of the greatest importance, so says Philippe Sands. And on the back it says, Germany, 1945, a country in ruins. Cities have been reduced to rubble and more than half of the population are where they do not belong nor want to be. How did a functioning society ever emerge from this chaos, let alone a respected world power? And with that, I hand you over to Michael, who is a regular facilitator and compere, or whatever the right expression is, for which we're grateful for. Over to you, Michael.
Right. Well, I suspect tonight, most of you will have got thoughts and ideas about the book. So I'm going to, I think, hopefully just facilitate the conversation. But a few thoughts. I particularly want to talk about 2 of the themes of the book. And the first theme is the polarity between chaos and order. And it's a wonderful insight into the chaos of Germany immediately after the end of the Second World War, probably for the period leading up to that as well. And we always think of Germany as being the most ordered place in the world, and the German psyche as being, you know, the most ordered possible. I've spent 60 or so years laughing at Simon and his heritage as order is the most important thing in all matters, and anything that's slightly late is unacceptable. But as sort of my day job is I teach philosophy, and one of the interesting aspects of German philosophy is that the chaos isn't that far beneath the surface. And Isaiah Berlin was particularly interested in Immanuel Kant. Kant described human beings using the phrase, the crooked timber of humanity. He doesn't mean crooked in a dishonest sense. He means that just as a tree, its timber can grow in any possible direction. And when you put the sapling in the ground, you have absolutely no idea what it's going to look like 20 years later. Similarly, human behavior is totally unpredictable and random. And for that reason, Kant has the most straitjacketed ethical system. He's scared at this sort of unpredictable human being and what they might want to do. So he imposes this fixed rational system. Kant lived all his life in Königsberg. As far as he hardly ever left. He was very, whether he knew what was going on outside Germany at all, we don't know. But Kant imposed on what he perceived as the chaos of humanity. He imposed this rational straitjacket, which to our eyes is even more bonkers than the chaos he's trying to stop. So, for example, for Kant, everything has to be done for a rational reason. So if you find yourself with a choice of saving your sister's daughter from drowning or a totally unknown person from drowning, you have to save the totally unknown person because you'd be doing that rationally to save the person, whereas the other, saving your sister's daughter, has too much emotional content in it, and you're not saving her because you rationally want to do it. You're saving her because you love your sister and you love the daughter. That's not a good, that's a frightening way of having an ethical system. So Kant is this German philosopher who's totally scared of chaos and tries ridiculously to impose something on the chaos of humanity. And you don't have to read many pages of this book to see how the chaos was not too far beneath the surface. Let's have a look at, I've taken some sort of strange examples. Esther, if you could see page 165. So here, 5 lines up from the bottom, we find out about Göttingen. And here's this very Germanic attempt to try and find order in the chaos. Would you give that one a go? You're muted.
Not something I've usually got the guts to do. Won't happen.
In the city of Göttingen, production targets were set and minutely quantified. In terms of men's clothing, 1,790 coats, trousers, underpants, and jackets were to be delivered, as well as 8,055 balaclavas. For ladies, 895 coats, 1,074 bras, 537 girdles, and 890 pullovers.
Right. So the meaninglessness of the order that's being imposed, I couldn't think of any ratio of why those numbers are relevant. Why do you need so many balaclavas? It doesn't appear that we have more than 2,600 or so people in need. That's the total number of coats. So why do we have 3 times as many balaclavas? They're wearing three balaclavas. It just seems that the order that they're trying to impose is almost as ridiculous as the chaos that they're trying to deal with. And then if you go back 5 pages, if you go forward to page 180, we see how the breakdown in the normal constructions of society. And this is a description of the difference between the black marketeers who are getting themselves sorted and regular people. So Esther, it's just that paragraph where we can clearly...
Right. We can clearly distinguish amongst people from these 2 worlds. We just need to take a tram or a train in a German city. Then we see the gaunt, hollow-cheeked faces from the world of cash values. These are the unfortunates who have had to get by for months on 1,000 calories, figures of inner depletion and famine. Next to them sits the man of material values from the world of exchange. We don't need to go so far as to say the black market, round, blossoming, complacent. Anyone who lights a cigarette in the tram today belongs to this world beyond legal regulation. Today, the underworld is forcing its way into the light. Even worse is the fact that it exerts a different kind of attraction on what remains of the middle-class world. The spirit of lawlessness is on the prowl, eating its way through the increasingly narrow wall that separates chaos and order.
So, thank you. I think it's just a fantastic description of how the construct of society, i.e. money, has totally disintegrated. No one's interested in money. It doesn't have, there's not a sufficient order in society for money to be worth anything. What's worth something are materials. Objects are worth things. And once you sort of abandon the value of the construct of society and you abandon the value of cash, well, law goes pretty soon as well, and no one's would be interested in law. So here you have the people who trade in materials. They'll light a cigarette in a tram because they're not interested in whatever legal regulation there is of not, I presume, no smoking on trams. And the spirit of lawlessness is on the prowl. So I think it's a beautifully clever evocation of what's going on as German society totally collapses into chaos, and people are trying to make their way, and the understanding that the old ways, the old laws, the old values, they've gone. It's objects have value. Society can't create any kind of value. And on that theme, I'd like to have a look at, if you go on to page 185. So he has a long chapter on rationing and ration cards. But I think this little paragraph here is a wonderful insight into the madness of the society. So it's the smaller paragraph that starts, the ration cards were.
Ration cards were a life lesson in themselves. The printed quantity was relative, like everything in life. 50 grams was 50 grams minus the quantity that wasn't available. Also relative was the price that was held to be fair on the black market at any given time. One gradually became used to the fact that for one part of the population, small change begins with a 1,000-mark note, for others with a 5-pfennig piece. Ruth Andreas Friedrich wrote in her diary in January 1946.
Right. So this idea that you were entitled to 50 grams, but you weren't entitled to 50 grams in the real world because there wasn't 50 grams. So all you were entitled to was 50 grams less what wasn't available, which I guess may have been 5 grams. So it gives you this contrast between the attempt to impose order, but the reality of the chaos. And I'm afraid to say, given the fact that this is Nazi Germany defeated, I didn't work up too much empathy or sympathy for the victims, and just over and again I found myself smiling that at least they've had their comeuppance in having to live this life of lunacy for several years till their society actually does manage to find itself in order. So I don't know, did other people find themselves delighting in the pain of defeated Germany, or were other people more sympathetic?
For my part, I certainly was not sympathetic, but I was also bemused. For example, there's a section which talks about the immediate capitulation of conquered Germans, chapter 10, it's entitled The Sound of Repression. If you don't mind, if I just read.
Yeah, please. Can you give me a page number?
Actually, slightly difficult. 297, even though it's just the page before 298, because it doesn't actually have a number on it. Basically, I'd be interested in people's views and how on earth this could be the case. The surprising thing was that after the battle was over, this was, in other words, the conquering took place over a long time, 1 meter at a time is the way they describe it. The surprising thing was that after the battle was over, barely a shot was fired. Wherever the Allies had taken a stretch of land, everything was suddenly peaceful. The invading soldiers couldn't understand it. These Germans, who had gone on fighting furiously long after the situation had been proven hopeless, were revealed as the tamest of lambs as soon as they had capitulated. The fanaticism seemed to fall from them like a second skin. No resistance, no rearguard action, no suicide units. And that is in contrast to what Goebbels had declared 2 months before. It says 2 months before the end of the war, this is on the next page, Goebbels had decreed that every German was now to consider themselves a part of Operation Werewolf and continue fighting to the point of self-annihilation. For the werewolves, he declared that Every Bolshevik, every Briton, and every American on German soil is fair game. Wherever we have an opportunity to extinguish their lives, we will do so with pleasure and without regard for our own life. Hatred is our commandment and revenge our battle cry. The werewolf is judge and jury and decides over life and death. In fact, hardly anything happened. The few werewolf operations that took place were carried out by regular Wehrmacht and SS soldiers, etc., etc. So, it seemed as if the fascism and the souls of the Germans had vanished into thin air. Instead of wild beasts waving people stood by the side of the road and took chocolate from the hands of the occupiers. How was that possible? Surely the hatred that had made them sacrifice even school children in the final battle could not have been a fleeting spectre, etc., etc. Where had they gone, the proud master race, etc.? So very odd. Your view, Michael?
Well, I'm going to start talking about the sense of victimhood that the Germans seem to have had at the time. And this does seem to be a sort of a moment where the German people suddenly go from being active supporters of the Nazi regime to becoming victims of the Nazi regime. So, but by the time the Allies are occupying, the German people have become victims of the previous 12 years and are therefore and call themselves as being liberated. So I think that's a very important issue. I suppose there's an element. He also talks about guilt as well, and how by taking on the identity of victims, they managed to assuage their guilt and not even consider themselves guilty. Yeah. So I think that
the inability to mourn, in other words, literally distancing themselves from the Jewish annihilation that had taken place.
Yeah. So I think I was amazed. The appropriation of the words victim and liberation by the German people in 1945. But we'll see that that's exactly how they describe themselves. And I think what you're pointing out is by that time, they saw themselves as victims.
I was surprised to see so little discussion in the book about any kind of German guilt. I thought that there were very few references to guilty Germans trying to make any kind of appeasement. But I mean, I think it's a very interesting book, and I think the whole idea that it starts talking about 0 hour as though you can just draw a line in the sand. And everything that happened before is just forgotten, and from now on we're just people like everyone else. And because of the, I mean, admittedly terrible circumstances in Germany post-war, as you know, in lots of other places post-war, that they then become victims. And of course, victims are always innocent. We feel sorry for victims. I thought that was interesting. And for me, that was more of a, I saw more of that in this book than any breast beating, to be absolutely fair.
Yeah, there was an awful lot of self-preservation about that, because they had no choice. Fighting on would have been fruitless for them, and so they adopted the victim position. It was easier. It made sense. It was logical.
But I didn't find that the victimhood was quite as affected as you might think it was. The way you, I don't think it was a decision. I think they genuinely consider themselves victims at that point.
Yeah, I don't think they necessarily thought of themselves as victims, but they simply wanted to survive and carry on with their lives. And they just let everything else evaporate, I think, as Simon read or Esther read. Everything else evaporated, their hatred, their fanaticism.
Right. I think they genuinely thought, well, I mean, we don't have that much evidence, but my feeling from the bits that he offers, I think there was a genuine feeling that we are the victims being liberated by our friendly allies. And I found that so jarring because, you know, until that moment, the victims were the people in Belsen and the liberation was going on there. And these people have no right to that terminology.
I think, if I can just interpose very briefly, the interesting thread that I've picked up so far, and I haven't finished the book, is how 1945 Germany turns into 1965, 1970 German economic success, and how he pulls the various threads together so that we get from A to B. And the thing that struck me was clearly in 1945, there were millions of people displaced, Russians fleeing the Germans, Germans fleeing the Russians, Russians hating the Poles fleeing, hating everybody else, and the Jews finding some sort of sanctuary in Germany rather than in Poland, which was their natural home. I found that really bizarre. And the thing I think that struck me, and again, I haven't got to the nub of it maybe, is how so many Germans could not go back to the towns or cities that they had come from because they'd been bombed to bits, and they found themselves eking a living in the countryside and in the farms, and how their view of life was clearly interfering with the order and the conservative nature of the towns and villages and the farms that they were inhabiting, and how that becomes sort of crisis and the reaction between the various social forces, which eventually seems to resolve itself into a unification of the spirit of the people into getting the economic miracle which we saw in the 60s and 70s. So it's only, I think the author says, it's only because of that strange relationship between the soldiers and the displaced persons coming into the villages and the farms that overturned the old order of certainty, conservatism, Catholic dogma, etc., which creates the new Germany. I thought that was a very interesting perspective. And then we have this strange situation of these DP camps continuing up into the mid-1960s, bizarrely, and people going to them because they had become institutionalized and they couldn't create a life for themselves outside the confines of the order that the DP camps had set up. So there are so many strands being examined that I think is really interesting analysis.
Right. I found the DP camps really interesting, particularly because I know of people who got married in the DP camps, Jewish people marrying, but the most unlikely partners seem to get together in the DP camps. I know a rabbi who got married to the non-Jewish woman who had hidden him. And it just seems to be that this is a completely different world, the DP camps, that it's insulated from all the normal norms of Jewish society and German society. And this is a sort of a wonderland where things will happen that don't belong in the real world. And then these people eventually come out of the DP camps, and life is very, very difficult for them. I thought the Jewish part of the DP camps was very interesting.
Mm.
What I'd like to do is we've been talking about this victimhood and liberation. I'd just like to focus in on that, and then that will give us, I think that's a very important part of the book. So the first mention of victimhood, Esther, your Roman numerals is now going to be called, it's XIII, which I believe is 13 in the preface.
The beginning. Okay. XIII. X13. Yeah. Okay, got it.
So yeah, and this actually talks about the theme of guilt as well. So it's that big paragraph, while memory.
Okay. While memory usually bathes the past in a softer light with the passing years, The reverse is true for the post-war period in Germany. In hindsight, it became increasingly dark. One reason for that lies in the widespread need among Germans who had not been persecuted by the Nazi regime to see themselves nevertheless as victims. Many people clearly felt that the grimmer the accounts of the genuinely terrible starving winters of 1946 and 1947, the more their guilt was diminished. But if we listen carefully, we can also hear laughter. A spontaneous Rosenmontag, Rose Monday, carnival procession passed through a terribly depopulated Cologne as early as 1946. The journalist Margaret Bovary remembered the feeling of life being enormously enhanced by the approaching nearness of death. In the years when there was nothing to buy, she had been so happy that she later decided not to undertake any major purchases, even when times improved.
I'm not quite sure what the second part of the paragraph is telling us, but I think the first part of the paragraph, that they saw themselves as victims by virtue of not having been, despite not having been persecuted, they saw themselves as victims, and the more they became victims, the more more things got tough. They found that a comfortable place to be. So even later in life, they lived their lives according to the rules of the winters of 46 and 47. And I think that was the first moment in the book when I suddenly realized that, one second, this book's going to tell us lots of very different things about who the victims are, who people who thought they were the victims, and what liberation means. So if Esther, if you go to page 5, on page 5, yeah, it's where can we start this? It's the appearance of an ox, so yeah, if you can go to the top. So this, I think it was a white ox appears, and 2 lines down, they surrounded it.
Okay. They surrounded it and gently maneuvered it by the horns, managing to lure it carefully into the background of the house. But what were they to do next? How do 4 urbane, cultivated citizens slaughter a cow? The conductor, who had a command of Russian, plucked up the courage to speak to a Soviet soldier outside the house. The soldier helped them to kill the animal with 2 pistol shots. The friends now hesitantly went to work on the dead creature with kitchen knives. They weren't alone with their booty for long. Suddenly, as if the underworld had been spying on them, a noisy crowd gathered round the dead ox. Do you want me to carry on?
Yeah, I'm afraid so.
Ruth Andreas Friedrich later recorded in her diary, they crept from 100 basements, women, men, children. Were they lured by the smell of blood? And within minutes, everyone was tussling for the scraps of meat. 5 blood-smeared fists ripped the ox's tongue from its throat. So this is what the hour of liberation looks like. The moment we have spent 12 years waiting for, she wrote.
So I just found that an astonishing tail end, sorry about the pun, of the story about the ox, because how can she possibly say that this is a moment of liberation? They were complicit. How can she possibly say that they'd been waiting for this moment for 12 years? They had been complicit. And then, if we look at, one of the important works of Holocaust history, Daniel Goldhagen, and the research he did to show that everyone who went to a camp was that they generated a rail ticket for that person, and the huge bureaucracy that was involved in generating those tickets to get those people there, or his stories about the wives of officers in the German army coming to watch them shoot Jews in the forests of near Hamburg. they weren't liberated. And it really jarred when I read that. And I don't know, Cecil, you were saying that it's a sort of affectation that they claimed. I wonder how genuinely they actually felt at this moment, that they've been looking forward to liberation from 12 years. Well, we don't see much evidence of that in the newsreels of of Hitler and co in public meetings. You don't see a 12-year-old desire for liberation. And I have to say, I found that it's great that the book brings this stuff, and he brings it. The beauty of the book is he lays it out in front of you for you to make your decisions. But I found that sort of shocking. I don't know how other people felt.
I think that the German population was seduced by the overwhelming presence of the occupying Allied forces, and they were forced into a kind of passive acceptance of it. It wasn't necessarily a liberation. I think there was very little guilt around. I think the guilt took another generation, the following generation, to raise that issue in Germany itself. I don't think that the adult population in 1945 had too much guilt. I think they just went along with this transition.
Well, and their guilt was assuaged by the terrible financial economic circumstances they were in. So they were able, on that level, to talk about themselves as victims. But the use of the word victim to describe someone
exactly
who's only getting 1,555 calories, as opposed to someone who's not getting any calories because they're dead, is it's
incomparable. It's incomparable. Completely.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it might be an interesting way to look at it, in the sense that if they were oppressed before, then they were oppressed by their own government, and suddenly they're oppressed by a foreign government. And I think that may explain why they suddenly felt victims. The other thing about the book, of course, is it's based a lot on anecdotal stuff. So this woman, Friedrich, whatever, she's quoted throughout. So in one sense, I mean, I think it's not necessarily easy, but possible to find the exceptions. So what he doesn't talk about percentages. He doesn't say 65% of the German population felt this. So we're often going back to anecdotal evidence from individuals who quite possibly, were resistant to the Nazi state, but we're now talking about the kind of the population in general, and that's a different thing, perhaps.
Well, I think he deals with it really well. If you have a look at page 316 and 7, where he talks about this feeling of, he talks about them having been tricked and exploited by the fiery ideological core within every Nazi, but they'd been tricked and exploited by the Nazi government. And that gave them their feeling of victimhood and self-victimization. And I think there's a really powerful, I have to declare an interest here. I don't know if it applies to you, Simon. So one of the things that my father was always insistent on is that we don't buy German goods. Are you a...
It didn't pass over.
Apart from the top Mercedes, that bizarrely, not really, even though there were people like schoolmates and so on whose parents absolutely wouldn't allow them to buy anything German made, which generally meant kitchen equipment and cars and so on, but wasn't particularly apparent in our house.
Well, apparently my Mini was made in Germany, so I've broken the rules unwittingly, but.
I think that Simon's parents wouldn't buy anything German, but by the time he was able to buy a nice Mercedes, they didn't have any control over his purchases anyway by that point. Oh
no, I had to swear a solemn oath to my father that I would never buy anything German. So
never did.
I didn't ditch the car when I discovered that it had been made in Germany. But have a look, Esther, this is all my final quote. Have a look about this quote from Adenauer on page 317 in his inaugural speech. And that will tell you why I think my dad had a point about not buying German goods.
In his inaugural speech as Chancellor in the German Bundestag, Konrad Adenauer addressed the question of amnesty for some mistakes and misdemeanors, which were the result of the harsh tests and temptations that the war and the confusions of the post-war era had led to. The government of the Federal Republic, in the belief that many have atoned for a guilt that was subjectively not heavy, is determined where acceptable to put the past behind us. On the other hand, it's absolutely essential to draw the necessary lessons of the past in the face of all those who challenge the existence of our state.
Yeah, so what is it? Mistakes and misdemeanors?
Yes.
That were the results. Mistakes and misdemeanors seems to be a little bit of an understatement. So, whose idea was that we should look at this book?
I think it was mine, wasn't it?
That wasn't mine.
Yeah, it was mine. Yeah, mine.
Oh, it's big success. I would say, first of all, insight into the actual 1945 onwards of Germany, but also insight into how humans can be so wonderfully deluded as to actually believe themselves, and also what happens when society falls apart. I think that was also a very interesting one. I think it's a terrific book.
The thing that also stood out for me was the effect of the Soviet development and the Cold War, and the steps that the Americans in particular, but the Americans, the Brits, and others were taking, which wasn't so much about compassion for people who perhaps didn't deserve that level of compassion, but more about protecting their position in the world and stopping the Soviets. So, for example, when the Soviets were trying to starve Berlin, and you have this, which is featured in the book, where they're landing every 2 or 3 minutes and colossal amounts were brought across, I think it was a year and a half or whatever, including the boat planes landing on Wannsee and so on. It was so much to fight against the Soviet attempt to be occupying and controlling and so on, resulting in the Cold War. So all of that comes through in description in this book, and that has a big effect in terms of what's going on. Yeah.
Did you notice how the phrase denazification and how that's been appropriated by Putin to explain what he's doing? And here you get the original denazification, which was obviously a very, very important, very important process. Although how honest they were about doing it, we see from the book, it wasn't always the most honest process. But the fact that he's taken that very powerful idea, that's what he's doing today, I thought that was sort of just an interesting add-on. So, Cecil, you think that they were consciously aware that they weren't victims and were just sort of playing the victim card?
Not very openly. It was convenient. It was a card of convenience. I worked for a pharmaceutical company, Merck KG, a German pharmaceutical company, and I joined there in the 80s and 90s, and they published a book about their history in the Second World War, because people had been looking into it, and it turns out that they'd used slave labor, and they didn't justify everything, but they made it clear that they had no choice in what they were doing. And I know for a fact that the people who set up the company and who were running it during and after the Second World War became billionaires and respectable members of society in Germany. And they were members, when they were young, they were members of the SS. And they were part of the German society that I see that just moved on. And maybe they were, maybe they weren't guilty of any terrible crimes, but to me, they reflect a lot of what Germany is all about and what it has become.
You're quite right. I mean, in the book, it refers to the Nuremberg trials. That was a tiny, tiny proportion of those who were guilty. And the level of those who were not punished for evil crimes is immense. Women in particular, by all accounts, from all the reading I've done. You agree, Michael?
Yeah, I thought that the photograph they had of all the paperwork on the floor in the office of the Nuremberg trials and these exhausted secretaries trying to deal with it. I thought that was a very powerful image of for the degree to which you just can't effectively bring that kind of justice, and it must be, and it ends up being somewhat random. Maybe it was
on page 314, I think it is.
Yeah.
In the print room of the Palace of Justice, exhausted translators, secretaries, and huge amounts of paper were left behind.
Yeah, that was.
I mean, the other point which touches on this, which is page 303, where it quotes Hannah Arendt, and it says, apart from the four-power city of Berlin, whose citizens are shear tested, still thoroughly hated Hitler, and where she sensed a free-thinking atmosphere with hardly any animosity towards the victorious powers, she was horrified by the mental state of the rest of the country, the widespread indifference, the general lack of emotion, and the obvious heartlessness were only the most striking outward symptom of a deep-rooted, stubborn, and sometimes brutal refusal to face up to what actually happened and come to terms with it. A shadow of deep mourning had settled over the whole of Europe, but not over Germany. Instead, a feverish, manic industriousness served to keep reality at bay. And it's described in the next page as inability to mourn. And then after that, on the following page, the murder of the European Jews represents a crime whose monstrousness affected the subsequent life of every German and plunged them into the undertow of unstayable as soon as they thought about it. This is why the majority of Germans did not immediately face up to their guilt. Germans kept their heads down. They grew tongue-tied. And hit the comments after, I've not yet seen a Nazi, etc. So they were hiding from the guilt that they ought to have felt.
Yeah, I think that does support Cecil's understanding of the thing. That there was a conscious desire, and you know that quote by Adenauer is amazing. Amazingly horrible, I think is the correct way of describing it.
They speak also in the book about the brilliance of the way in which those who had assets were forced to give up like half of them to all of those who were the majority who didn't. And that there was, as a result, an equality came through and a unity came through, which was then embodied when they got rid of the Reichstag, whatever the old currency was called, Mark, the Reichsmark, bless him. Yeah. Right, not Stag, yes, Mark, thank you, darling. The Reichsmark for the new, that then put an end to the unbelievable amount of black market and enabled regular trade to commence and so on. So there was that was the reunification, and that what got it all kicking and going off to get back to a normal existence.
I think also the fact that the Nazis were no longer the boogeymen. I think the new boogeymen was the communists.
Yeah.
So the whole switch in hatred and fear changed direction very quickly, and that helped the Germans' guilt.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in that they had allies across the West, so they became respectable members of the Society of Nations fighting communism.
Yeah.
So that was
the enemy of your enemy becomes your friend.
Yeah.
So they built the rockets which took men to the moon.
Sorry, Julian, I missed that.
They built the rockets that took the men to the moon. The Americans went to the moon.
Werner von Braun.
Yeah.
Is that right?
I agree with Cecil's idea, because I think certainly towards the end of the war, Hitler's attitude was, everybody has to have their hands dipped in the blood. So we're all in it together. And nobody could say they didn't know what was going on. They might choose to ignore what was going on, but at the end of the war, civilians were taken through the concentration camps to see what was going on, even though they professed they didn't know. So they all had their hands in blood.
Is that just part of human nature, or is it something to do with the German psyche?
I'm sure that's human nature. I'm sure that's human nature.
What I thought was really interesting about the book was that it was a writer coming from a German background, coming from Germany, writing for Germans. And of course, this is, we've read the translation. This was published originally in German.
Michael, what do we know about the author?
Oh, only what I looked up, I think, in Wikipedia, that he's an eminent journalist who's had chairs in journalism in universities across Germany. That's what I recall, and is considered to be an all-round good bloke. That can't offer you much more than that.
He's done a lot of research.
I think he confronted his parents about their past because they lived through the war, and I think he's writing from a second generation point of view, because I think the guilt of the Germans came through with the second generation.
Yeah.
In the immediate aftermath of the war, you had, like with the Jews who survived the war, nobody wanted to talk about it and everything was buried. And it was only once the Eichmann trial happened and everything became much more public that I think Germans started like bringing to the surface all the feelings of guilt and maybe soul searching. And certainly if the present generation have been questioning a lot what Hitler and the ordinary population did. But I think also the last few months of the war, there was a feeling that people were beginning not to agree with what the Nazis were doing and really felt that enough was enough and they wanted the war to come to an end. And they were dragging teenagers into the war and older people. And people were relieved, even with all the bombings and the ruination, that the war had come to an end. And they just, maybe like everybody else, just wanted to get on with life and try and rebuild.
I remember hearing anecdotal evidence in the 1960s and 70s that there were a lot of young German students going to Israel to work on kibbutzim.
Yeah.
And to kind of, I just wondered about that, and I don't think anyone's ever written about it, but it's fascinating.
The worst time, I know, because I worked on a kibbutz in the 60s.
And?
Yeah, there were Germans. Yeah.
So you have to ask yourself, why, what
I agree with you. I think the next generation did atone for the sins of their parents. I mean, it's a bit like the Austrians never really came to terms with their role because they said we were invaded, even though they welcomed the Germans in. The Swiss never accepted their role as money laundering for the Germans. A lot of people were complicit.
The Poles weren't that great.
The Austrians regard themselves as victims. Absolutely.
Correct. Yes.
Because they
and of course, Michael, you mentioned Adenauer. Adenauer, I think it's touched on in the book later on. Adenauer did engage with the Germans at quite a serious level. And he and Ben-Gurion formed an agreement which gave the technical know-how which enabled the Israelis to build the Dimona plant.
Right.
I'm not sure if that's in the book, but certainly there was engagement between Adenauer and Ben-Gurion.
I just want to jump in because I know, Michael, I think you are needing to go quite promptly towards the end of this. Is that correct, Michael?
I'm afraid so.
So what I wanted to just jump in before you leave is just to flag up what our next book is, which is Come Back For Me, which I'm sort of just showing you here, by a woman called Sharon Hart Green, who's agreed to be the person taking us through this book next time. And if I just read a little section of description, it is a novel. In the aftermath of World War II, Artur Mandelkorn, a young Hungarian Holocaust survivor, desperately searches for his beloved sister Manya. Seemingly light years away in time and place, the tranquil life of teenager Susie Kahn in 1968 Toronto is shattered by the sudden death of her Uncle Charles. In a panoramic tale bound by love and understanding, by loss and memory, and by secrets and silences, Arthur and Susie's stories come together in Israel after the Six-Day War. With heartfelt humanity, Come Back for Me, which is the book, evocatively illustrates both the scars left by tragedy and the possibilities for healing. And one of the many praises shown in here is, it says, this wonderful debut novel with great sensitivity and tenderness captures the emotional contours of loss and renewal that haunt the post-Holocaust universe. A joy to read. So it's certainly it's a well regarded book, and I hope will be good. And
what was the author's name again, Simon?
Sharon Hart Green, Hart-Green. And I know, Soph, you spoke to her today, didn't you? And she was enthusiastic, and it's going to be a date in September. We're going to work out the date and let everyone know.
Yeah.
Right.
Fantastic.
Thank you very much, Michael. I mean, yeah.
Michael.
What struck me when I first saw the book, I thought, actually, I know very little about what actually took place in Germany immediately after. It was like a whole new area I've never even given much thought to, and therefore it really was very interesting to read all of what was drawn to our attention. So
yeah, no, I think he's opened lots of areas for proper research, and maybe it's happening already. I don't know, but it is a very, very interesting period to have a look at. And if I just come back to you, Rodney, I don't think it's a German trait. I think it's a human trait. Just if I may say, I'd like to think it's not particular to one nation. It's just that we find facing guilt very difficult.
yeah.
I should also point out I've got a Neff oven. Well,
Right.
Good night, one and all.
Good night, everyone. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Good night, all.
Next time.